Chapter 5 Memory Train. Now, when you are trying to recall a succession of observed impressions, the images pertaining to these are observed as if they were actually arranged in an order corresponding to the order in which the original impressions were received. This supposed arrangement is called, as everybody knows, the memory train, and it is noticeable that the process of remembering events in the order in which they occurred is one which involves sometimes a very considerable mental effort. But if you are merely allowing your mind to wander, as in a daydream, without knowingly aiming at any definite goal, the set of images which is then observed appears to be arranged in a sequence which has little correspondence with any previous observed succession of events. Train of ideas. This curious succession of images is called the train of ideas, and it is possibly a very significant fact that the simple, undirected following of a train of ideas appears to entail no mental effort or fatigue whatsoever. Almost everybody has, at one time or another, amused himself by retracing the train of ideas which has led him, without any conscious aim on his part, to think of, or remember, a certain thing. I saw this, he will say, and that made me remember so-and-so, and that made me think of such and such, and so on. Here, however, is a specific example. It is now evening, and in front of me stands a teacup with a checkered black and white bordering. The sight of this, an impression, brings up for memory image of the checkered oilcloth floor covering which, this morning, I was using as material for an experiment in obtaining after impressions. Now, at the time of making that experiment I was thinking of Ward's description of these phenomena in the Encyclopaedia Britannica, and the next image to appear before me is an image of the red volume in question. Following that, there appears an image of an open page in the volume, and a very vivid image of the sensation of eye strain involved in its reading. That brings up an image of the reading glass I sometimes use. That brings up the image of the lens I borrowed in a fishing tackle shop yesterday morning in order to examine some trout flies I was buying. That brings up the image of the friend for whom I had purchased those flies, as he stood when asking me to do so. And that brings up the pleasing image of the 2.5 pound trout I annexed from that friend's water 2 days ago. Thus, starting with a teacup, I arrive at a trout. Now, examination of the nature of a train of ideas brings to light the following facts. Generic images. When a number of partly similar impressions have been attended to at different times, there is observable, besides the several memory images pertaining to those several impressions, a vague, general image comprising nothing beyond the key elements which are common to all those separate images. For example, the images of the hundreds of tobacco pipes which I have seen, smoked, and handled, all contain a common element which is now apparent to me as an ill-defined image of pipe in general. It presents all the essential characteristics which serve to distinguish a pipe from any other article such as, say, an umbrella. Such characteristics are hollow bowl, tubular stem, in short, an appearance of utility for the purpose of smoking. But this indefinite image does not exhibit any indication of specific color or precise dimensions. It seems, however, to be the nucleus of all the definite images of particular pipes to be found in my mental equipment, for, if attention be directed to it, there will quickly become observable the image of sometimes one and sometimes another of such particular pipes. These vague, almost formless general images are called generic images, and they appear to be analogous to a central knot to which the specific, definite images are in the relation of radiating threads. Associational network. It is obvious that many of these threads, these definite images, may be radiating also from another generic image. A definite image of a particular wooden pipe bowl may pertain, on one side, to the generic image of pipe, and, on another, to the generic image I call grained wood. That generic image may have, as another of its components, a definite image of a polished walnut table, which image, again, may also be a radiating thread pertaining to the generic image furniture. A thread from furniture, say, the image of a particular suite seen in a shop window, may be the link with the generic image antiquities. So far, then we are confronted with something analogous to a network of knots and radiating threads along the meshes of which attention may be led without conscious effort on the part of the observer. Ideas linked together in this manner graphically analogous to a network of knots and threads are said to be associated. Hence we may refer to the structure in question as the associational network. It is commonly assumed that association is of two kinds: association by similarity, as when one event recalls a similar event which may have happened long ago, and association by contiguity, which means that, when two events have occurred in close succession, the recalling of one leads to the recollection of the other. To the physiologist, the associational network is simply the network of brain paths, the knots being regions, or patterns, therein, and the connecting threads being paths which pertain to more than one such region, or pattern. All the phenomena of association seem to be adequately accounted for on that supposition, and on no other theory, so far as I can see, is it possible to account for association by similarity at all. In the absence of any other guidance, the path taken by the train of ideas seems to be conditioned very largely by the factor of freshness in the images. Other things being equal, an image which has been recently established makes a stronger bid for the wandering attention than does one which has long been neglected. The reader will notice that, in the example of a train of ideas given a little way back, all the images related to experiences which had recently occurred. For example, the black and white checkering of the teacup led me, not to chess, which is a very obtrusive generic image of mine, but to the piece of linoleum I had seen that morning. Physiologically, this would mean that brain paths which have been recently traversed offer a better passage to the currents of nervous energy than do those which have been allowed to fall into disuse. The supposed memory train does not appear to be anything more than a particular pathway through the associational network, the pathway which happens to have been thus recently traversed. If you try to trace a memory train back for more than a little way, you find that the path has ceased to be clearly marked out. The images do not come up in a steadily correct sequence of, so to say, their own accord. You have to help the memory out by reasoning as to which event must have happened next, and sometimes you reason wrongly. Dreams. Dreams, like many other mental phenomena, are composed largely of images supplied by an associational network. But they differ from mind-wandering in several important respects. In the latter form of activity, reason is nearly always partially at work to determine the course to be followed along the network. But in dreams this guidance seems to be largely lacking, and the dream images present themselves as real, though curiously unstable, episodes in a personal adventure story of an only partially reasonable character. Integration. Association between the dream images is sometimes clear enough, but, as a general rule, such association takes the curious form known as an integration. By this word we shall mean a combination of associated images in which the composing elements are qualitatively distinguishable. For example, the image of a pink dress seen in a shop window on Monday, and that of a shop girl seen when the same place is revisited on Tuesday, may combine, in Tuesday night's dream, into a single image of the shop girl wearing the pink dress. But on waking and recalling the dream, the two components of the dream image, dress and girl, are clearly distinguishable as images of originally separate impressions. Concepts. It will be noticed that, in the foregoing list of definitions, no attempt has been made to delve below that class of thought process which is styled imagery, a class in regard to which the psychoneural connection suggests itself very readily. Thought processes of a higher order are not yet properly, or even, perhaps, improperly, understood. Our knowledge of these is of the very vaguest description. There appear to be certain generalized ideas called concepts, such as, for example, those we employ when we think of eating, playing, imagining, or of difficulty, truth, deception, difference, but it is even doubtful whether these may legitimately be herded together under any such single class name. Compare, for instance, eating with a difference. The former idea may be no more than the stimulation of the more broadly determinative lines of some extensive pattern in the plexus of brain paths, but the latter may claim a connection with, or share in, every single idea we can formulate. It is here that the animist is enabled to put up his best fight in defense of the observer's alleged power of intervention. But even here the materialist may claim to have overrun a considerable part of the disputed territory. For the man whose brain has been injured by disease may, apparently, forget what eating is, or may be more than a little hazy regarding the existence of a difference betwixt himself and a grasshopper. Our present pathway does not take us across this particular battlefield, though we pass within hailing distance of the combatants. From them, however, we may accept the information that concepts are often determinants of the route that attention follows through the associational net. It is hardly possible for the unguided attention to dwell upon any concept without finding itself, a moment later, confronted by a generic or even specific image clearly related to that main idea. Part 2, the puzzle, Chapter 6. In this section, it will be necessary to relate, as briefly as possible, the regrettably dramatic and extremely misleading incidents referred to in the second paragraph of the first chapter. It will be noticed that the incidents in question mimic to perfection many classical examples of alleged clairvoyance, astral wandering, and messages from the dead or dying. It will be understood that they are described merely for their illustrative worth, and because they form part of the narrative of the actual proceedings involved. But, from one point of view, these occurrences had a value entirely unique. This was because I was not, as is usually the case in such matters, compelled to take them at second hand from some clairvoyant or medium, with all the important points left out and a mass of misleading suggestion thrown in. For they happened, one and all, to myself. The first incident provided a very fair example of what might easily have passed for clairvoyance. It occurred in 1898, when I was staying at an hotel in Sussex. I dreamed, one night, that I was having an argument with one of the waiters as to what was the correct time. I asserted that it was 4:30 in the afternoon. He maintained that it was 4:30 in the middle of the night. With the apparent illogicality peculiar to all dreams, I concluded that my watch must have stopped, and, on extracting that instrument from my waistcoat pocket, I saw, looking down on it, that this was precisely the case. It had stopped, with the hands at 4:30. With that I awoke. 42. The dream had been a peculiar one, and the net result of it all was that I lit a match to see whether the watch had really stopped. To my surprise it was not, as it usually is, by my bedside. I got out of bed, hunted round, and found it lying on the chest of drawers. Sure enough, it had stopped, and the hand stood at 4:30. The solution seemed perfectly obvious. The watch must have stopped during the previous afternoon. I must have noticed this, forgotten it, and remembered it in my dream. Satisfied on that point, I rewound the instrument, but, not knowing the real time, I left the hands as they were. On coming downstairs next morning, I made straight for the nearest clock, with the object of setting the watch right. For if, as I supposed, it had stopped during the previous afternoon, and had merely been rewound at some unknown hour of the night, it was likely to be out by several hours. To my absolute amazement I found that the hands had lost only some 2 or 3 minutes, about the amount of time which had elapsed between my waking from the dream and rewinding the watch. This suggested, of course, that the watch had stopped at the actual moment of the dream. The latter was probably brought about by my missing the accustomed ticking. But how did I come to see, in that dream, that the hands stood, as they actually did, at 4:30? If anyone else had told me such a tale I should probably have replied that he had dreamed the whole episode, from beginning to end, including the getting up and rewinding. But that was an answer I could not give to myself. I knew that I had been awake when I had risen and looked at the watch lying on the chest of drawers. Yet, what was the alternative? Clairvoyance, seeing across space through darkness and closed eyelids? Even supposing that there existed unknown rays which could effect that sort of penetration, and then produce vision, which I did not believe, the watch had been lying at a level above that of my eyes. What sort of rays could these be which bent round corners? From Sussex, I went to Sorrento, in Italy. Lying in bed there one morning, I awoke and fell to wondering what the time might be. I lacked energy to look at my watch, which lay outside the mosquito curtains, on a small table within reach, but out of sight when my head was on the pillow. It occurred to me to experiment with the object of ascertaining whether I could again see that watch in the apparently clairvoyant fashion of the earlier experience. Closing my eyes, and concentrating my thoughts upon wondering what the time might be, I fell into one of those semidozes in which one is still aware of one's situation. A moment later I found myself looking at the watch. The vision I saw was binocular, upright, poised in space about a foot from my nose, illumined by ordinary daylight, and encircled by a thick, whitish mist which filled the remainder of the field of sight. The hour hand stood at exactly 8 o'clock, the minute hand was wavering between the 12 and the 1, the second hand was a formless blur. To look more intently would, I felt, wake me completely, so I made up my mind to treat the minute hand as one treats the needle of a prismatic compass, and to divide the arc of its swing. This gave the time as 2.5 minutes past 8. That decided, I opened my eyes, reached out under the mosquito curtains, grabbed the watch, pulled it in, and held it up before me. I was wide awake, and the hand stood at 2.5 minutes past 8. This time there seemed to be no way out. I was driven to the conclusion that I possessed some funny faculty of seeing through obstacles, across space, and round corners. But I was wrong. Then came an incident of an entirely different character. In January 1901, I was at Alassio, on the Italian Riviera, having been invalided home from the Boer War. I dreamed, one night, that I was at a place which I took to be Fashoda, a little way up the Nile from Khartoum. The dream was a perfectly ordinary one, and by no means vivid, except in one particular. This was the sudden appearance of 3 men coming from the south. They were marvelously ragged, dressed in khaki faded to the color of sackcloth, and their faces under their dusty sun helmets were burned almost black. They looked, in fact, exactly like soldiers of the column with which I had lately been trekking in South Africa, and such I took them to be. I was puzzled as to why they should have traveled all the way from that country to the Sudan, and I questioned them on that point. They assured me, however, that this was precisely what they had done. "We have come right through from the Cape," said one. Another added, "I've had an awful time. I nearly died of yellow fever." The remainder of the dream was unimportant. At that time we were receiving the Daily Telegraph regularly from England. On opening this paper at breakfast, the morning after the dream, my eye was caught by the following flaring headlines: THECAPETOCAIROODAILYTELEGRAPH expedition at Khartoum from our special correspondent. K. Thursday. The Daily Telegraph expedition has arrived at Khartoum after a magnificent journey, etc., etc. A note in another part of the paper stated that the expedition was led by aeronautical. I heard or read subsequently that one of the 3 white men of the party had died en route, not, however, of yellow fever, but of enteric. Whether this was true, or whether there were 3 white leaders, I do not know. 1 or 2 remarks may be made here. I had heard, some years previously, that aeronautical was contemplating some such transcontinental journey, but I did not know that anything had come of the scheme. Certainly I had no idea that the expedition had started. The expedition arrived at Khartoum the day before the news was published in London, and thus long before I had the dream, as that issue of the paper had to get from London to Alassio, and the dream did not occur till the night before its arrival. This put any astral wandering business completely out of the question. I attempted no explanation. The next incident was as dramatic as any lover of the marvelous could desire. In the spring of 1902 I was encamped with the 6th Mounted Infantry near the ruins of Lindley, in the Orange Free State. We had just come off trek, and mails and newspapers arrived but rarely. There, one night, I had an unusually vivid and rather unpleasant dream. I seemed to be standing on high ground, the upper slopes of some spur of a hill or mountain. The ground was of a curious white formation. Here and there in this were little fissures, and from these jets of vapor were spouting upward. In my dream I recognized the place as an island of which I had dreamed before, an island which was in imminent peril from a volcano. And, when I saw the vapor spouting from the ground, I gasped, "It's the island! Good Lord, the whole thing is going to blow up." For I had memories of reading about Krakatoa, where the sea, making its way into the heart of a volcano through a submarine crevice, flashed into steam, and blew the whole mountain to pieces. Forthwith I was seized with a frantic desire to save the 4,000 unsuspecting inhabitants. Obviously there was only one way of doing this, and that was to take them off in ships. There followed a most distressing nightmare, in which I was at a neighboring island, trying to get the incredulous French authorities to dispatch vessels of every and any description to remove the inhabitants of the threatened island. I was sent from one official to another, and finally woke myself by my own dream exertions, clinging to the heads of a team of horses drawing the carriage of one Monsieur Le May, who was going out to dine and wanted me to return when his office would be open next day. All through the dream the number of the people in danger obsessed my mind. I repeated it to everyone I met, and, at the moment of waking, I was shouting to the May, "Listen! 4,000 people will be killed unless, I am not certain now when we received our next batch of papers, but when they did come, the Daily Telegraph was amongst them, and, on opening the center sheet, this is what met my eyes. Volcano disaster in Martinique town swept away an avalanche of flame, probable loss of over 40,000 lives. British steamer burnt. One of the most terrible disasters in the annals of the world has befallen the once prosperous town of Saint-Pierre, the commercial capital of the French island of Martinique in the West Indies. At 8 o'clock on Thursday morning the volcano Mont-Pelée, which had been quiescent for a century, etc., etc. But there is no need to go over the story of the worst eruption in modern history. In another column of the same paper was the following, the headlines being somewhat smaller: "A mountain explodes." There followed the report of the schooner Ocean Traveler, which had been obliged to leave St. Vincent owing to a fall of sand from the volcano there, and had subsequently been unable to reach St. Lucia owing to adverse currents opposite the ill-fated St. Pierre. The paragraph contained these words: "When she was about a mile off, the volcano Mont-Pelée exploded." The narrator subsequently described how the mountain seemed to split open all down the side. Needless to say, ships were busy for some time after, removing survivors to neighboring islands. There is one remark to be made here. The number of people declared to be killed was not, as I had maintained throughout the dream, 4,000, but 40,000. I was out by a naught. But, when I read the paper, I read, in my haste, that number as 4,000, and, in telling the story subsequently, I always spoke of that printed figure as having been 4,000. And I did not know it was really 40,000 until I copied out the paragraph 15 years later. Now, when the next batch of papers arrived, these gave more exact estimates of what the actual loss of life had been, and I discovered that the true figure had nothing in common with the arrangement of fours and noughts I had both dreamed of and gathered from the first report. So my wonderful clairvoyant vision had been wrong in its most insistent particular. But it was clear that its wrongness was likely to prove a matter just as important as its rightness. For whence, in the dream, had I got that idea of 4,000? Clearly it must have come into my mind because of the newspaper paragraph. This suggested the extremely unpleasant notion that the whole thing was what doctors called identifying paramnesia, that I had never really had any such dream at all, but that, on reading the newspaper report, a false idea had sprung up in my mind to the effect that I had previously dreamed a dream containing all the details given in that paragraph. Moreover, reflection showed that the Cape to Cairo vision might very well have been of the same character. Indeed, The more I thought of the two episodes, the clearer it became that, in each case, the dream had been precisely the sort of thing I might have expected to have experienced after reading the printed report, a perfectly ordinary dream based upon the personal experience of reading. Chapter 7. To my great relief, could I be sure that those dreams had not been false memories 2 years later, by the act of completely reading, squashed the identifying. But there was the watch business to be taken into account. I dreamed that I was standing on a footway of some kind, could not be made to consisting of transverse planks unless I were a great deal madder than I could bring myself to beyond believe, which was a deep gulf filled with thick fog. However, absolutely satisfied that neither I had an impression of Cairo nor in the Montpellier dream had there been any not clearly seen, for the fog direct vision across except 3 or 4 yards of the planking ahead of me with its attendant portion of represented gulf. These dreams had been induced either by the reading of the paragraph far down in the gulf, by telepathic communications from the journalist in the Daily Telegraph office who had written those accounts. It reached above the plankway, in other words, and was slanted, it was extremely unlikely that I should have been visible through the fog, at precisely half past 4. As I stared at it, it began to wave slowly up and down, points out that I should make this more clear since the question was essentially what the object was. The improbability of my having dreamed before in a cinema picture of a fire must be in the early days by the improbability of my having been bothered by a stopwatch on the previous afternoon. I had undergone the same puzzlement as to what the faintest recollection of such a fact, until I had realized that it was the long water jet from a fire engine era of which I photographed. African exploration was a subject of great interest somewhere down in that gulf. Then, this was the first fire engine on which the dark continent had been crossed in this direction, hidden, and the event was a news of the first magnitude. As I perceived this, the dream became perfectly abominable. The wooden plankway became crowded with people, dimly visible through the smoke. They were dropping in heaps, and all the air was filled with horrible, choking, gasping ejaculations. Then the smoke, which had grown black 53 and thick, rolled heavily over everything, hiding the entire scene. But a dreadful, suffocated moaning continued, and I was entirely thankful when I awoke. I was taking no chances with identifying paramnesia this time. I carefully recalled every detail of the dream after waking, and not till I had done this did I open the morning papers. There was nothing in these. But the evening editions brought the expected news. There had been a big fire in a factory somewhere near Paris. I think it was a rubber factory, though I cannot be sure. At any rate, it was a factory for some material which gave off vile fumes when burning. A large number of work girls had been cut off by the flames, and had made their way out onto a balcony. There, for the moment, they had been comparatively safe, but the ladders available had been too short to admit of any rescue. While longer ones were being obtained, the fire engines had directed streams of water onto the balcony to keep that refuge from catching alight. And then there happened a thing which must, I imagine, have been unique in the history of fires. From the broken windows behind the balcony, the smoke from the burning rubber or other material came rolling out in such dense volumes that, although the unfortunate girls were standing actually in the open air, every one of them was suffocated before the new ladders could arrive. This dream left the whole business more puzzling than ever. It seemed that nothing could explain it. For clairvoyance is not an explanation. It is a meaningless expression, a mere admission of inexplicability. And telepathy required an enormous amount of stretching before it could be made to fit the facts. Then came a dream which somewhat simplified matters. For it ruled out definitely insanity, clairvoyance, astral wandering, spirit messages, and telepathy. But it left me face to face with something much more staggering than any of these. In 1904, a few months after the fire dream, I was staying at the Hotel Scholastica, on the borders of the Arschensee, in Austria. I dreamed one night that I was walking down a sort of pathway between 2 fields, separated from the latter by high iron railings, 8 or 9 feet high, on each side of the path. My attention was suddenly attracted to a horse in the field on my left. It had apparently gone mad, and was tearing about, kicking and plunging in a most frenzied fashion. I cast a hasty glance backwards and forwards along the railings to see if there were any openings by which the animal could get out. Satisfied that there was none, I continued on my way. A few moments later I heard hoofs thundering behind me. Glancing back I saw, to my dismay, that the brute had somehow got out after all, and was coming full tilt after me down the pathway. It was a full-fledged nightmare, and I ran like a hare. Ahead of me the path ended at the foot of a flight of wooden steps rising upward. I was striving frantically to reach these when I awoke. Next day I went fishing with my brother down the little river which runs out of the Arshentsee. It was wet fly work, and I was industriously flogging the water when my brother called out, "Look at that horse!" Glancing across the river, I saw the scene of my dream. But though right in essentials, it was absolutely unlike in minor details. The two fields with the fenced-off pathway running between them were there. The horse was there, behaving just as it had done in the dream. The wooden steps at the end of the pathway were there. But the fences were wooden and small, not more than 4 or 5 feet high, and the fields were ordinary small fields, whereas those in the dream had been park-like expanses. Moreover, the horse was a small beast, and not the rampaging great monster of the dream, though its behavior was equally alarming. Finally, it was in the wrong field, the field which would have been on my right, had I been walking, as in the dream, down the path towards the bridge. I began to tell my brother about the dream, but broke off because the beast was behaving so very oddly that I wanted to make sure that it could not escape. As in the dream, I ran my eye critically along the railings. As in the dream, I could see no gap, or even gate, in them anywhere. Satisfied, I said, at any rate, this horse cannot get out, and recommence fishing. But my brother interrupted me by calling, "Look out!" Glancing up again, I saw that there was no dodging fate. The beast had, inexplicably, just as in the dream, got out, and, just as in the dream, it was thundering down the path towards the wooden steps. It swerved past these and plunged into the river, coming straight towards us. We both picked up stones, ran 30 yards or so back from the bank, and faced about. The end was tame, for, on emerging from the water on our side, the animal merely looked at us, snorted, and galloped off down a road. Now, it seemed to me that from this incident one thing was abundantly clear. These dreams were not percepts of distant or future events. They were the usual commonplace dreams composed of distorted images of waking experience, built together in the usual half-senseless fashion peculiar to dreams. That is to say, if they had happened on the nights after the corresponding events, they would have exhibited nothing in the smallest degree unusual, and would have yielded just as much true, and just as much false, information regarding the waking experiences which had given rise to them as does any ordinary dream, which is very little. They were the ordinary, appropriate, expectable dreams, but they were occurring on the wrong nights. Even the watch dreams were merely the dreams I ought to have had after seeing the watch. In the first of those incidents I had, when awake, seen the watch lying face upwards on the chest of drawers, with the hand stopped, and the corresponding dream image had been of a stopped watch, face upwards. In the second instance I had held the watch up facing me about a foot from my nose, while lying with my head on my pillow, and the reader will remember that the corresponding dozing image had been of a watch in precisely that position. The white mist had been, of course, the image of the mosquito curtains, out of focus, as these were, when I looked at the real watch. No, there was nothing unusual in any of these dreams as dreams. They were merely displaced in time. That, of course, was staggering enough. But I felt, nevertheless, that it had been a great advance to resolve all these varied phenomena into one single class of incident, a simple, if mysterious, transposition of dates. But in all this speculation I was still a long way from the truth. The two remaining incidents I propose to relate in this section contained nothing to alter my half-formed opinion that temporal aberration constituted the whole of the mystery involved. But, had I not made this semi-discovery, I should certainly have regarded the following incident as a message from the spirit world or a phantasm of the dying. In 1912 I spent a good deal of time at Salisbury Plain, experimenting with one of my stable aeroplanes. A military aeroplane competition was in progress, and most of the officers of the then tiny Royal Flying Corps were there. One of these I had not met before, nor did I see very much of him. In fact, I do not think I spoke to him more than twice. Since these records are not evidence, or intended to be regarded as such, it will suffice if I refer to him as Lieutenant B. The other officers were all old friends of mine. Shortly after the conclusion of the competition, the annual army maneuvers began, and, having nothing to do with these, I went to Paris to inspect another machine which was being built there to my design. One morning while in that city I dreamed that I was standing in a very large meadow, situated in a landscape which I did not recognize. In this meadow a monoplane landed, crashing rather badly some 50 yards away. Immediately afterwards I saw B coming to me from the direction of the wreck. I asked if much damage had been done. He replied, "Oh no, not much," and then added, "It's all that beastly engine, but I've got the hang of it now." The dream was a longish one, all about aeroplane accidents, and BS smash was by no means the worst thing I saw. I awoke to find the servant by my bedside with the morning tea, from which fact I was subsequently able to fix the hour of the dream as close on 8 a.m. B was killed between 7 and 8 that morning, falling into a meadow near Oxford. But I did not read of the accident till about 2 days and a night later. But now, note the following points. 1. Engine failure had nothing whatever to do with the accident, nor could B for one moment have ever thought that it had. For the monoplane was planing down, with the engine partly or entirely stopped, at the time, and the accident was due to the uncoupling of a quick-release gadget in one of the main lift wires, and the consequent breaking upward of one wing. Of course, the planing down may have been compulsory, and due to engine failure, but there could have been no doubt in B.'s mind that his wing had broken. On the other hand, B had made to my sister, while we were at the plane, a remark about the engine almost exactly like that I heard him make in the dream, and it is more than likely that she had repeated it to me. She would naturally have done so. 2. B was merely a passenger in the machine. It was being piloted by another man, a stranger to me, who was also killed. There was nothing of this in the dream. But when I read the paragraph about the catastrophe, it was B.'s name alone which caught and held my attention, and I did not know of the death of the other man until I looked up the record of the accident several years later. 3. The paragraph did not state the cause of the accident, and so left me with nothing to go upon but B.'s past remark about the engine. 4. The coincidence in time was not really remarkable. Dreams of aeroplane accidents were, as I have said, very frequent with me in those days, and between 7 and 8, when the noise of motor traffic in the streets begins to penetrate to one's consciousness, has always been my hour for this particular class of nightmare. So I concluded that here, again, the dream was associated with the personal experience of reading the paragraph. In the last incident of this series, the chronological aberration was far more considerable. The dream occurred in the autumn of 1913. The scene I saw was a high railway embankment. I knew in that dream, knew without questioning, as anyone acquainted with the locality would have known, that the place was just north of the Firth of Forth Bridge, in Scotland. The terrain below the embankment was open grassland, with people walking in small groups thereon. The scene came and went several times, but the last time I saw that a train going north had just fallen over the embankment. I saw several carriages lying towards the bottom of the slope, and I saw large blocks of stone rolling and sliding down. Realizing that this was probably one of those odd dreams of mine, I tried to ascertain if I could get the date of the real occurrence. All I could gather was that this date was somewhere in the following spring. My own recollection is that I pitched finally upon the middle of April, but my sister thinks I mentioned March when I told her the dream next morning. We agreed, jokingly, that we must warn our friends against travelling north in Scotland at any time in the succeeding spring. On April the 14th of that spring, that Flying Scotsman, one of the most famous mail trains of the period, jumped the parapet near Burntisland Station, about 15 miles north of the Forth Bridge, and fell onto the golf links 20 feet below. The above-described incidents have been selected from a group of about 20 simply because they were closely studied and carefully memorized at the time of their occurrence. Most of the others were merely noted, so to say, en passant, and are now almost completely forgotten. Curiously, I can remember no dreams of the coming Great War, except one. That one related to the bombardment of Lowestoft by the German fleet. I recognized the place as Lowestoft, but had no idea of the nationality of the bombarding vessels.